I would love to continue building throughout Madagascar. I think there's an estimated need for about 22,000 schools. So just to make a dent in that would be amazing. But of course, we would love to go beyond just Madagascar too, because I know that there are similar countries where there's a huge need for infrastructure. But I think how we scale it would be to then set up multiple printers and then have a way to enable local people to then learn and then teach others how to do it. Hello.
Hi, Maggie. Give us a bit of story about, how you came to what you're doing and how you got there.
Of course. So at the moment, I am running Thinking Huts, which is a nonprofit that plans to increase access to education around the world. But right now, we're planning to build our first 3D printed school in Madagascar.
You are going to be using a 3D printer. You tell us, but I think you're using 3D printers to print schools.
Yes, correct.
World where they don't have any, which is an unbelievable thing to be doing.
Yeah, but you're starting with the idea of printing a wall, and then the wall gets constructed into schools. Like, how do you think of how it gets constructed?
So I guess to break it down, we have just done the foundation. So this is a traditional material. It's a concrete slab that's excavated on site. And then the next step would be the printer to come. So for us, that would be in the spring when the travel borders would allow us to transport it. And so once the printer is on site, then the walls will then get printed from the ground up. It'll stop about a third of the way, and then we need it to harden. And then the next two sections would be completed. But ours is a bit different in that it's a hybrid design. So we can still incorporate traditional materials for the roof and then all the beams within that, and then the windows and door. So I would say the 3D printed part is the walls, and then everything else is still a traditional way.
How did you get interested in Madagascar in particular? Because you could have built it in the Amazon or Indonesia. Like, why Madagascar?
Very true, but we do have personal connections there and a Madagascar team, which is very important if you're working in any developing country, I believe, especially just making sure you have community support and buy-in. So that's what led me there. But it's been about a 7-year journey. I had this idea back when I was 15. So it's been a while trying to get to the point to launch this pilot. But in that time, I did a lot of research with the technology, seeing which printers were available, and then also the countries too. So I reached out to a lot of grassroots type of nonprofits who are very close to the communities and work with them just to see what problems within education existed. And that's how I was led to Madagascar.
So did you go to school to learn about the 3D printers, or was there a specific place you learned about that, or did you just teach it to yourself? How did you figure that out?
It just goes back to a conversation with my dad, actually. We were in his office one day and just talking about where we thought the future of technology was heading. And I'd always been fascinated with how we could apply innovation to more humanitarian problems that we're facing. And I'm very passionate about increasing access to education. So that's sort of how that idea was sparked.
Now, why education? You could be interested in a lot of different areas, but why does education speak to you?
I believe that education is at the root of solving the other problems in the world, and it's a root cause situation. So if we can increase opportunities that way, it'll go a lot further and have a lot longer impact compared to maybe another area in the world.
So you have such interest. Sorry, you just have such an interesting story, though. We want the audience to have a little bit of a backstory, like why your own journey with your parents. If you could just give us a little bit of that, I think it's important.
Of course. So I was adopted from China when I was about 18 months old. So this really set the stage for the rest of my life, just knowing what poverty looked like. I came from a very rural village, I would say, and I would not have had the opportunities if I wasn't adopted or had the chance to go to private schooling, which a lot of people here don't even have access to. So just knowing those privileges really shaped my life moving forward.
Have you been back to China?
I have not yet, but I really hope to in the future. I think it would be a really moving experience to just see where I came from, and then also being able to reflect on where I came from too.
Yeah. So, you have a feeling that you want to do something for others, does it come upon you gradually that education's the way? Do you go through a bunch of other things first, or do you just start with education?
I think it was always education for me, even seeing it with my peers who maybe got a scholarship to go to school. I understood that a lot of people just didn't have the same opportunities. And if people just were given that, then they could do so much more in their life and go on to do what they're passionate about. And I think a lot of times, especially what I noticed growing up, is that people would choose a more safe route just for financial stability when it may not be something that they are truly fulfilled in doing.
Do you you were in England, you started in China, you've lived in different parts of the United States. When you thought about doing philanthropic things, did you travel to other parts of the world?
I did not. I looked into Indonesia, Cameroon, and then also India for other countries, but I did not myself go there. I also felt that within the nonprofit world, especially, I understood like with mission trips, it was more on a personal experience rather than the people who you would hope to serve and how they saw it. It was always important to me to get their perspectives before I would then get my own on it, if that makes sense.
You found 4 potential partners, talked to them about what they wanted to do, and then narrowed it down to the one because you felt like they most reflected the things that you wanted to do?
Yes. Also, I would say I started with what problems they were facing, because within education, it may not just be schools. So I wanted to start where infrastructure was the largest problem and then make sure the partner also aligned with the values. Since we're focused more on creating the infrastructure, I wanted to make sure that teachers were also supplied and that it would still be maintained after we would go on to build with other partners.
So do you go to Indonesia, or do you decide that this is our partner, we're going to work with them? Not Indonesia, Madagascar.
I decided remotely because when I was finishing up the location finalization, it was actually the very beginning of the pandemic, January, I would say. So I never got to go to the location. So I've been planning this pilot all on my computer, essentially.
Well, yeah, the world is now such that you can do it all on your computer. Yeah.
Yeah, which is, I guess, a blessing and a curse at times, but definitely it's opened doors to make it easier to interact with people overseas, which may have not been as easy before.
So I have a question around, you said in the beginning of our conversation, if we start with education, then it solves these other problems. So can you go a little bit deeper about that? And also, you're working in these different countries, but do you have plans in the United States as well? Because we need help here as well. So 2 different questions. Let's start with education.
I think with the first one, I would say that it has a generational impact that you may not see overnight, but it goes on beyond just the one student who goes to school. So then they go back to their community, and then their parents also get that knowledge transfer. And then it also has an impact on the economy. And so you see a positive correlation with the GDP. And then beyond that, even with like gender norms too, you'll see a decrease in child marriage because they have another option rather than having to rely on another source of income.
Yeah, really critical.
So you're going to do it all on your computer. When you make that decision, do you start to talk to the people in Madagascar about what their needs might be? How does the planning go? Like, is it because what's unique to Madagascar and not, you couldn't just build it in Iowa?
What my thought process was for Madagascar is that we also had the government support in the sense that the president prioritizes school construction. So it was already built in there. So we would have a potential to scale. And then in terms of the location itself, we are actually starting on a university campus just to streamline the operations before we go out into more rural locations. One of our board members was born and raised there and a professor at this particular university. So that's how we got to the location.
The bricks that you're going to make, that you're going to print. So do you have to think about what the sand is like in the place where you're going to make them? Has that become a factor in the ingredients you're going to use?
So actually how it will work is it uses a proprietary cement mixture. So it'll be extruded from the ground up. So it won't be individual bricks. So it just goes more of like a circular motion, if that makes sense. And then it will build the wall from the ground up. But for the mixture itself, it will need to be shipped in for this first project. But then we intend to mix it in country. So then we can continue to support local labor that way.
Give us a sense of like the scale of how big this is and how many, printing operations does it take to build a school? What are we actually talking about, square footage, et cetera?
So the printer itself, I believe it's 8 meters in height, and then it can extend to 15, I think. So it is quite large, and I sort of describe it like a transformer where you build it and then it's a lot bigger. So that's the biggest transportation consideration, I would say, just the weight of it.
Now, does the community have input into it, and how do you select that community to build the school?
So the communities are largely selected by the partners we work with. So they will propose a location and then we make sure it's structurally sound. And then it is important that we take into consideration their feedback too. So that's the exciting thing about this pilot in Madagascar. They would then be able to come to this first site to then see what they might want to be modified in their community. So the same school may not be replicated for another community. Like it might look similar, but they might have input for modifications, like maybe they don't want a vertical garden on the inside or something else we can change too.
How many students, like just give us a sense of how the age range, going from how old and how many students do we think this school will accommodate?
So for one hut, it'll accommodate around 35 students. The first school will be for ages 16 to 18. It's on a university campus engineering quad, so those students will be able to then be involved with the printer when it comes. But in the future, we're aiming to have more primary age students.
Is your goal to build the school, or do you think about the curriculum and who the teachers are? And, what makes an idea like this become sustainable in your mind?
Yes, that is a huge consideration. That's why we have an emphasis on local partnerships who can fill in those gaps, because that's something that we thought about in the beginning. It would be hard to try to tackle everything. We just wouldn't be as effective. So to focus on the infrastructure side of building the schools would allow us to streamline it and achieve those economies of scale. But on the side of local partnerships, I think that comes down to just vetting the people, making sure that they are trustworthy, and then they will be supplying the teachers, and making sure that our schools are utilized so that it can be sustained.
Maggie, did you look at different models, like, things that work that's happening in the NGO space? And, what was there something that inspired you to think, okay, I'm going to go do this? Because this is a huge effort. I mean, this is a big thing that you've started here.
Yeah, I don't know if I was inspired by a particular organization, but I think just growing up, I knew this was the path meant for me. So I was drawn to the space, and I think that just influenced why I wanted to work on this. But definitely other nonprofits and how they formulated their model shaped us in figuring out a new way of doing things. Because I think when you're bringing in technology that hasn't really been seen within the school construction space, you can't be the exact same as other people have tried to do.
Less CO2 emissions, building the walls so that they're hollow. How do you arrive at those sort of innovative ideas and get them into the design?
I think I was largely inspired by honeycomb and then seeing how the printer worked. I think it's always been hollow walls. So I thought we could easily try to make it into a hexagon looking design, but I don't really have a very logical explanation for how I came to it. I just sort of had it in my head and the architects came up with it.
The building seems like they're designed, they have sort of a design to the outside of them. Is there an important idea there? Like, how are you thinking about that?
Yes, so it was important to figure out a way to honor local culture. So I'm hoping that for each community we work with, that they will have an artist paint a mural on the outside. So that's a symbolism of that.
The community, have they embraced the idea? Do you have a view into how they're thinking about it?
Yes, they are very excited about it. We actually conducted over 200 surveys for the particular one that we are building this first school in. And it's just really exciting to get the support at this stage too, when it's still essentially more of a vision.
So you have an idea for a 501c3, it's going to be a charitable foundation. So what's your first step? Like before you know how to do anything, like what's your first idea? I want to build some schools. And then what do you do from there?
A lot of it was just going with the flow and figuring out, because I didn't have a model to follow. But the first step I remember is that I think we applied for the 501c3 status, which took a really long time. I think it was over 8 months to get the response back. And then from there, I was really waiting for the technology to develop. And then I did a lot of research within the education space and just the issues that did exist.
Who you share the research with when you get it? Is it just for you or is it for others?
I think mainly for me at that stage, because I was still balancing school at the time. I didn't have the team I do now. It was more of like a solo endeavor until I took it beyond just the idea in my head.
So you sort of go, okay, 3D printing, this could be an idea that it could help me accomplish my goal. Do you just call up the 3D printer and say, hey, I want to talk to you about building a school?
Yeah, a lot of it was just cold outreach and seeing what stage their technology was at. And a lot of times it just wasn't ready for commercial use. So I kept searching and seeing what progress had been made in the area.
How, you talk about your, your parents and, how, because for other people watching this who may have been adopted, may have come from another country, of course. So were your parents really embracing, your heritage, right? Where you come from? So how much was that sort of the conversation around your story and letting you know your story? Because it seems like it's such a wonderful part of who you are, this integration of where you came from and then where you are now, right? So it sounds like that was a real effort on their part to do that. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so I think for my parents, they never made me feel like I was different. And I think that is what made me feel safe, like growing up and understanding where I came from. Like it wasn't necessarily a bad thing. I think I can't speak for all people who have been adopted because I know that there are serious problems and also just difficulties growing up in a new area and maybe unresolved conflicts that I've heard like with other people that I grew up with that went through a similar background story. But for me, I had a genuinely positive experience. I knew that my birth parents wanted a better life for me. So I think I was raised having a more positive outlook of what my life could be.
Did your parents teach you, just that anything was possible? Because this is certainly a very tough dream to accomplish.
Yes, of course. I would say so. A lot of that would be encouraging me to go after my ambitions too, because it definitely is a large undertaking, but I never really thought of that until like people started hearing about the project and they would tell me, wow, like what a large thing you're trying to accomplish. But yeah, I think just having my parents' support and telling me that I could do it really helped me, because I think if on the other hand, I was told, oh no, you couldn't do it, I don't think we would be here today.
When did you start this? When did you start the organization?
I was 15, so quite a while ago now.
When you had to find funders along the way to support your work?
Yes, a lot of it has been individual donors that I've been lucky enough to come across, but I think that's another reality check that I've realized in terms of trying to run a nonprofit, how difficult it can be, because a lot of people are just focused on return on investment and how much money they can make rather than maybe a different type of impact and the social aspects of it.
Yeah, it's hard to find a measure that isn't money, as if goodness isn't enough. So that becomes a complicating factor. For scaling it, how do you scale this idea? You're doing one school in Madagascar. Is the goal to do 10 schools in Madagascar and then move on to another place? How are you thinking about it?
I would love to continue building throughout Madagascar. I think there's an estimated need for about 22,000 schools. So just to make a dent in that would be amazing. But of course, we would love to go beyond just Madagascar too, because I know that there are similar countries where there's a huge need for infrastructure. But I think how we scale it would be to then set up multiple printers and then have a way to enable local people to then learn and then teach others how to do it, because it is such a large problem they would be undertaking. So we would need a lot more people involved in order to scale it up properly.
But now you're talking about really the core thing, which is capacity building, sustainability, by bringing in local people to do the work, then it drives the economy. So kind of these things that you were talking about earlier, you start to see how that might manifest. I think one thing that is interesting to think about is we're working on some other projects with the UN and GIGA and UNICEF, and that sort of lack of internet and that sort of bringing in 3D printer, bringing in the technology. So how do you think about that is also another barrier or something how do you think about that problem?
I think it's another exciting thing that I hope to also include with our solution with the infrastructure, because I know that internet is definitely a huge disparity that we're seeing here, especially trying to navigate with online learning. And a lot of people in areas like Madagascar may not even have access to it. I hope that we can understand how to maybe incorporate things like Starlink, where you can get people connected to the internet, but in more remote areas, and then have the schools themselves be essentially like central hubs that communities could use.
You've been doing this now 7 or 8 years. What kind of people have you met in this journey? And are they different kinds of people than you think you would have met if you just stayed on a normal journey?
I think I've met more people who are altruistic. They don't really expect anything in return. And I think it is quite a paradox of sorts, because I was a business major. So a lot of what I was taught is maximizing shareholder profits and all of that. And so I don't think I would have met those people if I did not pursue this path.
Have you enjoyed this journey?
I would say overall, yes, but there were definitely bumps along the way. But I think that's what makes it worth it at the end, just knowing you stuck through it. And I think it really is worth it to see the people that you're impacting, and they're really excited just to be a part of it. I think that's the most touching thing, just receiving the messages from people in Madagascar about how the project inspires them and that they hope to be involved in the future. I think that's the biggest thing that I've been able to see from it.
When do you plan on going to Madagascar?
I'm hoping at the end of spring, which is when we're hoping to complete the school. I think a lot of things have just been really altered with the pandemic, especially for travel, and then just trying to transport a large equipment that may have not been received before there in the country is definitely a hurdle we found to be more problematic amidst this whole thing we've been going through.
Yeah, wow.
Maggie, it's funny you just said, well, you're a business major, maybe it isn't the same thing, but the way that you're talking about this, the return of value is probably a lot greater than a traditional business model, because what you're really talking about is, again, as we talked about, that sustainability, providing economy. You've got teachers going, you get teachers back to work. I mean, you're creating a little mini economy inside of each opportunity. So I would say it's a pretty tremendous thing for people to just who are watching this. It's Thinking Huts. Go find out what Maggie's doing. She can always use some help in any way that you might be interested in learning about this work. And we want you to come back when that school is built. We want to see pictures, so we'll stay connected with you. Maybe we can have you join from Madagascar. You can give us a sort of a virtual FaceTime tour of everything. But fantastic work you're doing.
Thank you, Maggie, very much. Thank you for spending some time with us.
Well, thank you both. And I would definitely love to stay in touch, and I'll send over the photos.
Please.
All right, stay warm there in Iowa.
Yeah.
Will do.